The time in between, I've mostly been a 3D developer, so this stuff is relatively new to me. And so you're probably going to see some of the more amateur hour coding mistakes and such while watching me, as opposed to some of the other programmers on our team. But we'll power through it nonetheless, and you'll get a look at my process as I figure out and learn things that I do not know or understand yet. So today's goal is going to be to get like the animations for the little gun goblin man hooked up to his movement. So right now, if I kind of just play test this with Steam and get open now, this should work. He can move around, he can jump, he can do those movement things, but the animations do not respond in any sort of way. He's stuck facing one direction, and even when he's jumping, he just kind of looks like he's walking at all times. So our animator has made some clips for that, and all I need to do is sort of implement them into code. Now, the way we're going to do that is we're going to take this player controller that the other programmer made, and we're going to go ahead and make this a base class. And we're going to have subclasses for the individual characters and their movement, since movement might differ between the different characters, but they're all going to have relatively the same basic functionality for the most part. The trouble now is remembering what exactly I do to make a base class. This is something I learned fairly recently as a way to copy basic behavior across multiple different types of things. But I think everything needs to be public, I know that, so these will need to be public if they want to be accessed by other scripts, including the subclasses that will subscribe to this public class, the player controller. So this one is also subscribing to a class. It's subscribing to network behavior. I'm not entirely certain what that one does, but I'm guessing it's something to do with the multiplayer, and I will do my best to not step on any toes there. That's the fun part about touching other people's stuff in a group project. You never know if you might mess someone's stuff up. It's a little scary at times, but that's why you use tools like GitHub, and you're able to kind of stop those mistakes from messing up everyone. You can always go back to a previous version. So that's my hope here. If I mess anything up, we'll just go back to a previous version. But yeah, I think everything needs to be these public virtuals as opposed to just the typical public or private labels for the functions. And with that, any subclass should be able to access all functions and all variables from this script. And if I'm wrong, we will find out later down the road. So the next thing to do will be to create a new script to be the subclass for the gun goblin character. I do have a folder called character ability scripts. I think I'm just gonna, and the only thing in there right now is the gun goblin character ability, so I think I'm just gonna call this folder gun goblin. And we'll put his movement and his ability stuff in this folder. So now we'll call this one GG movement. Cool. Now this will be interesting because I'm not sure what's going to happen with the fact that like this thing that we're using for the base class is also subscribing to another class other than mono behavior, and I hope everything just carries over nicely. I would assume that it would, but this is my first time trying it, so I guess we will find out together. So this will subscribe to player controller, which is our little movement script over here. And now before I write any specific code, bear in mind, even though that script is empty, it will have all of the functionality that the base class it is subscribing to did. So we'll go to this player prefab that we have. And this player controller script will no longer be needed, as we will now add the GG movement script. And as you can see here, if we make the comparison, we have a bunch of different fields here for movement settings, even though we didn't write anything in the script, because it is subscribing to the player controller script, which also has all of those fields. Before we get rid of this, it would probably be wise to copy all of these values to make sure everything's consistent with how it was before. Because I would hate for the other developers to be testing this and realize, hey, this guy moves nothing like how he did before. So we want him to move exactly as he always has, just with the animations now. Ground check radius is 0.25. Rigid body, I'm assuming, is just on here. So we'll drag that down. Fill that. Yep, and is grounded will be off to start. Ooh, the rigid body field is empty on this. I'm curious if that affects anything. For the time being, we won't remove this. We'll just turn it off. And if in the course of our testing everything tends to work out fine, then we can remove it. And it looks like, based on this, everything is moving according to plan. We can still collect items. And yeah, the moving turret was a little bit interesting there. We don't want that to happen, really. Oh, that is a jump of all time. Wow. Okay, so from that little test there, we can see some things are performing in a way that probably is not as intended, because if I turn the player controller script back on and turn off the GG movement instead, we can kind of mess around, do what we were doing before. And I don't see any crazy, ridiculous jump happening, even after using sort of the same abilities. We cannot move while in the turret. The reason for that is that the GG ability script looks for a reference to the player controller script, and it will turn that off while the turret is active. But of course, it's referring to the old player controller script. It does not have a reference to the new Gun Goblin movement script. So when we had that active, you could still move while in the turret. Now, yeah, just trying to recreate that insane jump. It doesn't look like that is something that can happen with the old player controller. Now if we go down here and turn on the Gun Goblin movement, we'll try to recreate it again. Trying to remember just what exactly was happening. We had the turret. Yep, and then coming out of the turret, the jump becomes absolutely insane. And we probably don't want that to be the case. Being able to jump right off the edge of the screen is less than ideal. So there's two things that could possibly be happening here. I think if we test one more time, it might become apparent. So I do the ultimate here. gets in the turret. And immediately after that, we unlock the insane jump. Now, there's two things that are different about the GG movement script as opposed to the old player controller, and these are the fact that we actually have the rigid body field filled out here, and the fact that the GG ability script does not have a reference to the GG movement. Now, since this special jump seems to be triggered by the fact that GG abilities, or it's triggered by the ultimate, essentially, is what appears to be happening. I'm guessing it might have something to do with the ability script and the fact that it's not actually referencing. Actually, I believe I figured it out. I think both movement scripts become active after the ultimate because what the ability script basically does is it will turn on the player movement script after the ultimate is finished. So even though we have this player controller turned off right now, and we don't want it to be on during this scene, what's going to happen is I'll do the turret ultimate, and once that finishes, I thought it was going to turn on the player controller, and then basically what we're going to have is like double the force being applied to the jump. And that's why it's going so high, is because two scripts are applying force to it. And that actually kind of should be happening based on the logic as I remember it. Yeah. So at the end of the Gatling duration coroutine, player controller dot enabled becomes true. Now that's not appearing in the inspector because I'm not in the scene. I am on the player prefab, but if we go to the player clone instance that has been spawned into the scene, there's the player controller script, and it is in fact enabled, and it has the rigid body field filled out here. So yeah, what's happening is we have two movement scripts applying force to the jump, and so it becomes absolutely ridiculous. So to remedy that in the test, what we'll go ahead and do is we'll go back to our player prefab, and then we will make sure the ability script is referencing the GG movement script instead. And now if we join, jump is fine before, we activate our turret, the turret duration ends, and we no longer have that ridiculous, insane jump. Perfect. So now our first step is out of the way, things are behaving as expected, and we can go ahead and start modifying this player movement, this player controller, to include the animations that we have for movement. So there's two things we need to do. We need to make sure that the sprite is flipping based on the direction that the player is traveling in. And then we also need to make sure that the jump animation sequence is actually being played when the player decides to jump. And so I've kind of set up these transitions in the animator here. We have some triggers and some bools. So it's a trigger jump to go into the jump animation. And then if it's going up, we'll have this GG up loop playing for as long as going up is true. And then it will transition to going down when going down becomes true. And then it'll play the GG land when the trigger land happens. And then from there, it'll go back to the idle. So we need to make sure that's included in code, and we also need to make sure the flip is happening. I think the flip will be a lot easier to do. So we'll go ahead and start with that as a nice sort of warm-up. And so as I mentioned, I don't know a ton about 2D, but as I was kind of just messing around in the project the other day, I did figure out that there is this simple flip value on the sprite renderer that can flip the sprite across the X and Y axes, respectively. So what we need to do is if the player is doing inputs in the other direction, we just need to turn the flip X on, essentially. And to my general understanding in Unity, basically, if there's anything that you can do in the inspector, you can do that through code as well. So we'll go into our GG movement script, and the first thing we'll do is we'll set up a header. It's actually like surprisingly hard to talk and program at the same time, as I'm finding out. So the header will probably be something like, I don't know, sprite settings, call it something like that, and then we'll have a serialized field. We have the autofill here, sprite renderer, sprite renderer. There should only be one sprite renderer, so that name should be specific enough for our purposes. Now, we'll have that, and we want to flip it when the player is inputting the other way. By default, it's facing right. We want it to go left if the player is doing a left input. So we should have probably a, okay, this is interesting. Yeah, so the player controller is a little rougher than I expected, in so much as it's using input.get button down and input.get access raw, which are kind of old-ish ways of taking input. There's the new input system, and yeah, I've been using that for like as long as I can remember. So yeah, I'm pretty sure like the get button down is just referring to some like general Unity input setting that has jump, and it's not the same as this, which is like the input map for the new input system. So I might want to edit this a little bit so that it's using the new input system. And that's important because the new Unity input system allows for like very easy mapping across multiple different like input devices. So like you could have a keyboard, and yeah, if you've ever seen this, it's like you can, I haven't done the mapping for everything yet, but the move, for example, actually, that's not a good example. Wow. Kind of looking like an idiot now. But basically, you can add multiple bindings. Usually, I swear by default, like there are gamepad, that is to say controller inputs assigned to these things by default. But maybe we're just working with keyboard for now, so maybe those got deleted at some point. But yeah, you just add a binding. And yeah, Unity's been a little temperamental. Maybe it's for me, maybe it's something with the new version where I've like added bindings and they just don't appear for a while. I could come back to this on another day. Okay, yeah, so Unity Inspector's been weird for me, as in like if I don't save, something might not show up, and then if I save it does. And so now we see, okay, not only have I added this empty no binding here, but now I see the gamepad and XR controllers. XR is like VR stuff, so like Oculus, that sort of thing. But yeah, you can see the gamepad bindings. Yeah, so this jump will include all of these things on all of those different input devices, but I don't think that goes, it's not the same as the input.get button down. I think that's from an entirely different, older Unity input system. So it's very good for a rough player controller because a lot of resources are out there for this stuff, so it's very easy to quickly throw something like this together. But now we'll go ahead and take it a step further by using the Unity input system. So I'm trying to remember what I called this. Generally, I name them controls, which I have here. So we'll have a public controls, and then we have this public override void on network spawn, and I think essentially this is going to be sort of a almost the same as start or awake, but it's based on when the player gets brought into the multiplayer lobby, so to speak. And so, oh, there's a sprite renderer in here, interestingly enough. I'm not sure if we do anything with that later on, though. So var SR, which it underlines and says unnecessary assignment. Because I don't think it's included anywhere else. Well, there's one way to test this. We can comment it out, and if anything shows up underlined in red, we know there were references to it, but nothing shows up, so I don't think this was being used. Oh, actually, I see now. Yeah. I remember what happened now. So a while ago, what we did was we gave... Yeah, as this... If I just read the comment, I would have realized this a lot sooner. Give each player a unique color so you can tell them apart. And we used to basically have, like, the sprite would be tinted one color, and the idea behind that was to be able to tell them apart, because right now we only have the gun goblin character in, so if a bunch of people joined a lobby, they would all be the same character with no way to sort of differentiate them besides you just keeping track of yours and knowing what you're doing. So, but we do want a sprite renderer because, yeah, we have ours declared over here. But if we just made this a field that we could fill rather than a var that's just declared here, we can go ahead and do more stuff with that. So we'll just say visual settings for this header. I think that'll get the point across. Then we'll have a public sprite renderer, and we'll just call it sprite renderer like so. And we'll hopefully fill that in the inspector. Shouldn't need to make a get component call here. So I will go ahead and comment that out. And we can probably do the axis flipping thing in this base class, because I would imagine that pretty much all our characters, we're going to want them to face the direction that the player is doing for input. And so now back to our input system, we have our public controls. There's a couple things we need to do with that. And it's just something I've done so many times that just gets autofilled. It's like, yeah, like literally right here. Visual Studio already knows what I want to do. Basically what we're doing here is we're making a new instance of the controls, which is important, I think, especially in multiplayer games, because each player wants to have their own instance of the input map, because otherwise you would have one person being able to control like all the characters in the lobby or something. At least that's my understanding of it. And then of course you enable it so that it can be used, because you do need to do that with the input maps, something you didn't have to do with like the input get button down. Yeah, you never had to like declare something and enable it. So a little bit of extra steps in the programming, but does save you on like being able to have multiple different input devices. So now, instead of input.getButtonDown jump, what we will use instead is controls.player. So this takes us to this player section here, and then the next thing we want is jump. So then .jump, and then we need to make a specification here of what we're checking. And we're going to check, was it performed at this frame? And there's some other ones that I think have caused me trouble in the past, like was pressed this frame. Like you can do that, but I think for certain inputs it might not work. So it might work really well if you have like a keyboard and you're using WASD, and so your movements for like pressing things as actual buttons, whereas like a gamepad might use a joystick, so you're not actually pressing a joystick. So that's why was performed this frame I think is a better general catch-all for most inputs. And then the other thing we need to do is get the move x, velocity, the linear velocity, all this stuff. Now this is a little bit more interesting because I know that input.getAxis raw, I believe, is just getting the horizontal movement only, as is commented here. Now movement with the input map, if you'll look here, it is a 2D vector. So I think I can get just the x from that without much issue. I'll just go controls.player.move. I think it's read value vector 2, but we just want the x, not the y. So that would be, hopefully, how you set it up with the new input system. And then we have, okay, and that doesn't look like we have any other instances of the old input system. So we'll go ahead and test this now to make sure that our new changes still work. And as we can see here, even with the new input system, everything still works as expected. And just because I'm paranoid, I will check that that previous bug that we had just to make sure it's gone for good, which it is. So we're good to go ahead and proceed here. So the fact that we're using horizontal movement only, I think, simplifies this quite a bit. And I think basically if the player is moving right, the x value will be positive. If they are moving left, the x value will be negative. So basically we could just check if it's positive or negative, flip it or don't flip it. But to be sure, I'm going to go ahead and debug log this value right here, just to check. And this is where my programming slows down a bit just because of my inexperience. I'm never too sure of myself. But there's nothing wrong with a little bit of testing. It does help. So if we were to scroll down to the bottom of the console here. All right, it's not keeping up, but you can see way down here in the very bottom corner of my screen, bottom left here, it's pretty tiny, but if I'm moving back, it's -1. If I'm moving forward, it's 1. So I was correct. It'll be negative if the player is moving to the left. It will be positive if the player is moving to the right. So the next thing to do is to have this if statement here. So if move x is greater than 0, we'll go ahead and take sprite renderer. Flip x equals false. Okay, so as we can kind of see here, the autofill, probably from GitHub Copilot, is guessing what I'm trying to do here. And it is absolutely correct. We are changing the value of that flip x in the inspector. Or rather, we're changing it through programming, not the inspector now. But like, yeah, if we were to look at the inspector, this flip value here, false is unchecked, which is forward, which is how it is right now. And then the otherwise, the else if move x is less than 0, we're going to change that flip x to true. And now, if we go back into, we'll go out of the prefab here, back to our scene, go ahead and host. Ooh, we forgot to assign a value. Amateur hour. Visual settings, sprite renderer. So we need to grab that sprite renderer from way up here, drag it all the way down. This is excruciating to do and I hate it. Actually, there was probably a faster way. You know what? I'm going to test it. I think I can just grab the player. Yep, and because there's only one sprite renderer, or actually, even if it was 2, it would just grab the top one. Yeah. just grab it from the hierarchy over there and drag it in. A lot better than trying to drag it down like I was before. So now that field is filled, we shouldn't have any more null reference errors. Go forward, we can go back, and we now flip depending on which direction we're facing. And even the animations will also flip and go in that direction. So that is the first of our conundrums. There is one slight issue, and that is the turret placement. The turret placement will go behind because that wasn't just an animation, that was also an instantiation. And so it's instantiating the turret in the same position that it was before. So we'll go ahead and see if we can address that really quickly. And the best way I can think of doing that is we have a reference to the player controller. We can take a look at that sprite renderer because the player controller sprite renderer is a public variable, so this script will have access to it. So I'm pretty sure we can just... Where is the turret placement? Oh, visibility to mechanics, okay. Maybe I should comment on these. So we'll call that turret place. This was like gun roulette. And this is Gatling gun. Wow. GitHub Copilot is scarily good at guessing what I want. And... yeah, so back down to our turret placement. So this is the instantiation. Before we instantiate, we will want to change the X offset, I believe. Because, yeah, we're changing where it goes horizontally to be sort of in front or behind the game object itself. So if player, oh my goodness. And it's already guessed what I want. Yep. So if the flip X is true, which means it is now flipped, it is facing left, we're going to do a negative turret X offset. And then otherwise, we'll do the positive offset as we have before. Yeah. Feels like I'm hardly lifting a finger. And I kind of am. Kind of not. I obviously have to have the idea to go in there and fix that thing. But wow. It's scarily good. So we got that turret placement now is relative to the direction the player is facing, as opposed to just always being about one in front of the game object, regardless of how the sprite is turned. So that minor bug fix is out of the way. The next step is figuring out how we do this jump sequence. And I will say right now, I am kind of aware that this probably isn't how the animator is going to have to look by the end of the game. So this is kind of rough just for now, because there are definitely going to be instances where you can probably jump up onto a platform and you get onto that platform without ever starting to fall down. Like you kind of just jump up and you land right on the ledge before you even start going down. So the up loop might need to be able to transfer to the landing animation as well. And that's not anything too crazy, so maybe we can make that transition land. And that there might be some other edge cases I'm not quite thinking of. So if any of you geniuses watching this happen to know and could leave an answer for me in the comments below, that would be super, super cool. Otherwise, we will go ahead and proceed with what we have for now. So we'll go back into our movement here. I believe the player controller Oh, it does not have a reference to the animator, but that is something that all of these will have. So we'll have a public animator. Now, to avoid any situations like before where I go to test and a field is empty, we will go ahead and fill that in the prefab right away, so I don't forget this time. So our animator's right there, and we can grab that because we don't actually have to do any scrolling in this particular instance. And now we are able to grab that animator. So I'm kind of thinking, unless there's some fun physics way to do this, the best way to sort of judge how this is going to go is, obviously if the player presses jump, we will go ahead and set that jump trigger to get that initial jump part of the animation set, but then as we get into the looping parts of the animation where there's an up loop and a down loop, we'll probably have to basically check. I think I'm going to have two transforms, one that is the previous transform a frame ago and the transform now. And basically looking like, okay, is it higher than it was before? And we might want to also create some sort of like float variable that is used for checking like how big of a difference that is and comparing it like, okay, because if it's like a 0.0001 difference in elevation, that might just be something trippy going on with the rigid body and the physics, getting it slightly higher than it was before, and we don't want to just like randomly buffer the going up animation if we're just like walking on some random terrain. So yeah, I think that's kind of what we need here. So we will probably want to take the jump function and we'll make a public override void jump. So this is going to take precedence, is going to override the jump function from the player controller. Instead of doing this jump, it's going to do this one instead now. But if we want to include all of the things that were in the previous jump function, we can do base.jump, and that's going to do all the things we did before, and now we can include our additional functionality. And it's very, very simple. Surprise, surprise, GitHub Copilot figured it out. We're going to set the trigger, the jump trigger, on the animator. And that will be sort of the first step here. And we can go ahead and test to make sure that's working, because we haven't really seen if anything specific to the GG movement works yet. Okay, and it appears that it does work. So we get that jump animation, but then it has nothing to transition to because it does not have a transition back to idle. It only has a transition to Gun Goblin up loop. And the issue with that is that we have not done anything in programming to change this bool and allow that transition. So he's kind of just stuck on the last frame of the jump animation, is what you're seeing there. So we're going to want, so the only time I could imagine the character is going to go up is if the jump is triggered. So we could start a coroutine in the jump function, and that coroutine could perform and run until we eventually land, and then that land trigger gets set, and then the coroutine ends. And that way we're not doing things in update. Because having update run all the time if you don't need it to is just like, it's an unnecessary thing. But update is already going to run every frame in this function anyway. So we might as well. Yeah, we might as well just abuse that, since we're going to anyway. So update's running, and in update, We can probably handle that bool logic. Trying to think here though. Do we want to... I almost feel like these things that we're putting into this gun goblin specific movement script are sort of pointless. Or not pointless. It's pointless to make it a subclass at this point because yeah, like all characters are going to have a jump and need to handle this jump logic. But I suppose we can cross that bridge when we get there. We can do the things in this subclass for now, and can transfer it over to the base class later if it turns out to be universal functionality. So, go ahead and we'll have our public override void update. And that autofill already included base.update. Perfect. Fine by me. Although is update doing anything with the animator? Well, it wouldn't because this thing didn't have an animator until I added it. So... we'll go ahead. We'll have our current transform and we'll have a previous transform. Now we got to think about timing for when we're going to set these. So I think the best way to do it is we'll have previous transform is equal to the current transform. And at the start of update, current transform will be the transform of the game object that this script is on, which is what this dot transform basically is referring to. Now before we set this, that's when we want to do our check. I always feel a little good when this happens. GitHub Copilot has not caught on to what I'm doing yet. I'm too big brain for it. I'm smarter than the AI. So, we're not going to be comparing current transform.position.x. We're going to be comparing current transform.position.y. Position.y. So if the current y value is greater than the previous now it's kind of caught on. So this 0.1f here, this is kind of that that other float I was talking about where we want to like make sure we're actually checking a certain amount of distance between the elevation change so that like if there's the tiniest change in elevation we don't make a transition in the animator, especially one that we couldn't because if we're like on the ground still. Actually no, it does check if we're grounded or not, so we wouldn't necessarily have that issue. But yeah, just making sure that like we're not trying to do the animation at the slightest changes in elevation. We want there to be a considerable change. So we will have private float. Don't know what I want to like call this. maybe like jump space. Yeah, jump space threshold. That's about what I'd call it. Yeah. But just because I'm stubborn and prideful, we're going to call it like jump spacing check, which is what I had in mind. And we're going to change that to jump spacing check. So if we do decide that we want it to be less than or greater than that 0.1f, we're able to change that in the inspector instead of having to go into the scripts to do that. Now, so if the y position is greater than the previous y position by that threshold, that spacing check, we're not calling it threshold. I am better than the AI. The jump spacing check. Then we want to set the going up bool. So that was, what did we call it? Going up. Perfect. Very descriptive. So going up will become true. And the inverse is this, basically, but we're looking at less than. Then we know we're going down. And we'll set going down. Then this is tricky because we got to set up the trigger for landing, and we want that to trigger, you know, like if we're grounded, but we don't want it to be running every time we're grounded. We only want it to be happening if we were falling or we were going up, and then we land. We might need a Boolean here. Something more than just is grounded. So that's going to be updating all the time in base.update. Which actually raises an interesting point. We might want to do this before the base update functionality. Actually, the base functionality is what checks for the jump. And fixed update is where we have the ground check happening. Okay, this is interesting. So fixed update is going to do its stuff. Basically, like, if is grounded was false the last frame, but it is now, that's when we'd want to set the land trigger. And there might be a good way to do that very, very simply. So basically, if ground check is not null, then it does the physics 2D overlap circle, okay. Yeah. Yeah, it might just be easier to have all of this stuff in the base class anyway. We pretty much know, for the most part, that this stuff is going to be happening for pretty much every character. I don't think we have any characters that like aren't going to be able to jump. Sure, that jump might feel a little different for each of the characters, which is why it's important to have this this subclass. Like, even if you have nothing in it, actually, never mind. I'm not going to finish that thought. About to say something silly there. No, the subclass is not important for the reason I was about to state. Subclass is important for if you want to do very specialized functionality based on this original functionality, but this stuff I think is going to be something that happens for every character. They're all going to have a jump. It's going to be animated every time. So yeah, we might as well transfer all of this over now. Jump function. Paste that there, so then we don't need this anymore. And then all these are going to come public if we move them over to the base class. Same is true for this. So we'll cut that, bring it to here. I guess we'll paste it under movement settings. Then we can take this. We'll put it sort of before that base functionality as we had it before. Then we have our base stuff, which will obviously already exist in the base class. So then we just need to take this, cut it out, bring it into update here, and then we can get rid of this as well. So now there is nothing special about our subclass for now. As we continue to flesh out these characters and make more animations for them, it is likely that we will add more specialized mechanics for them. So that might come in a later video. Or you might not get to see it. You might just get to experience it when you guys do finally play the game. You're going to play it, right? Okay, so now everything is in the base class. Where was I? I'm going to do stuff in fixed update. Basically, what I want to do here is I want to add an additional if statement here, where if is currently false before we change its value with that overlap sphere. So if it is false now, and we perform this check, if it is now true, we're going to set the bool, and it's not a bool, it's trigger. Then we'll land. And I don't think we need to put this in anything special. We want this to happen anyway, and I don't think it's a big deal if it runs twice. But let's go ahead and put our stuff to the test. Okay, so immediately right off the bat, I knew something felt off about how I was handling the previous movement, or the previous transform, and the current transform. So we get an error on this line here, because previous transform has not been set yet. It's null. So we're making this comparison in the if statement here with something that doesn't exist, which is an issue for Unity. And this is because, yeah, on the first frame, the transform is nothing, basically. So I don't know how I want to do this. In my head, I was thinking, like, We'll set up an if statement and we'll check if the first frame is happening, and if the first frame is happening, we'll skip this stuff or something. It's probably better to just set up a check. If current transform is not null and previous transform is not null, then we can do all this. Once we get past that first frame, they should always not be null, so this should be running as much as we want it to once that is all done. Okay, so now we'll test again, hopefully not get that error. Okay. And I did suspect something like this might happen. If we check on our animator state, we are stuck on the jump animation once again as we were before, which means that going up was probably never set to true. And this, I think, is likely because if we try to watch a little more carefully here, I think by the time that jump animation is finished playing, we're already descending. And that causes an issue because we can only transition from jump to the up loop. We cannot transition from the jump to the down loop, but we can change that. So we'll make a transition here. If going down is true, after this is done playing, then it will transition to the down loop. And we got stuck on the jump animation once again. Oh, that's interesting. I just touched something and we're back to idle. And we are very dead stuck. We can't go into any of our abilities or anything. It would be interesting if going down never gets set to true either. Oh, going down. Yeah, so here's a lesson in relying too much on the GitHub Copilot autofill, because that was set to false, even though I know going down, we would want to check that that is true. But because of the fact that I used the autofill and then just started editing that, I forgot to edit that pool. Okay, so now I'll click here so we can have the animation tree pulled up and we can watch all the transitions happen. We jump, transitions to the down loop, which runs, I think, about twice there, is what I saw with the naked eye, and then it goes to the land, and we are now back in our idle position as we should be. But this whole situation does raise another question of, like, what if the jump animation is happening so long and then we land on some platform that's like up here-ish and we never even get to the falling once again. Like, by the same logic that up has to transfer to land, I think jump will have to go to land as well. So we'll say if the land trigger is set, we can transition from the jump animation to the landing animation. It seems like we're kind of able to buffer the jump pretty quickly, and then the animation timing sort of gets thrown off. And it might be the result of all of the exit time present in the animations currently. We've got quite the spider web going on here. I'm just kind of curious how this will go if I just untick the has exit time on like all of these. Oh, that one is necessary actually, because that's the only condition. But after getting rid of all of that, how does this feel? Kind of about the same. And another interesting thing is you can't really use the abilities in midair because there's no transition from these things down to the various abilities. Now, the animator is something that I have not spent a lot of time in myself, as I am not an artist. I have not made animations for any of the games I'm really working on, and a lot of the stuff I've been working on has been small-scale projects like game jams, where, you know, not having animation for everything isn't the worst thing in the world. It certainly takes off a level of polish, but game jam projects aren't always the most polished to begin with, so it is what it is. And so we essentially accomplished what I set out to do for the night, which is getting those animations hooked up to the movement inputs, and we can now flip and look around in different directions and such. But there are still issues with this system. So I will continue to work on this, refine it, polish it a little more, but that's a look at my programming process and how I go about doing these things. And hope you guys maybe learned a thing or two, or at least found it interesting, and I'll see you in the next devlog. Citrus out.